Ashtabula, Ohio, April 1907. The air off Lake Erie still carried a winter chill, a damp, heavy cold that clung to the piles of iron ore and the skeletal steel gantries of the docks. Along the breakwater, where the company had laid out a grid of small lots for the immigrant workforce, a man was doing something deeply strange. Where the floor of his new cabin ought to be, Jaan Kirov was digging a hole. He was not using a team or a scraper, just a spade and a wheelbarrow, his movements methodical and unhurried. The hole was rectangular, precise, its edges sharp against the clay soil. He worked alone, a quiet figure in a landscape of noise. The clang of ore buckets, the shriek of steam whistles, the multilingual shouts of men moving the raw material of a nation. His neighbors, mostly Irish, Norwegian, and Finn, stopped to watch. They were practical men, dock workers and fishermen, who understood the brutal logic of a lakeside winter. You built high and tight. You caulked every seam. You laid a floor on sturdy piers to get away from the frozen ground, not invite it into your house. "What is it you're building there, Kirov?" called Patrick O'Malley, a broad-shouldered stevedore from County Cork, leaning on his shovel. "A private grave?" A few men laughed. Einar Larsson, a Norwegian fisherman, whose hands were permanently cracked from ice and brine, shook his head. "It's a root cellar, Pat. A fine place for potatoes, a foolish one for people." John paused, straightened his back, and wiped a bead of sweat from his brow with the back of his wrist. He looked at the hole, then at the men. "A place to sleep," he said, his English clipped and carrying the music of his native Estonian. The laughter died into murmurs of disbelief. A sleeping chamber below the frost line, in the damp, cold earth? It was madness. The idea spread down the row of shanties and rented rooms, passed along with a shake of the head and a knowing smirk. Kirov's Folly, they started calling it. The man was building a tomb for his family before the first snow even flew. That afternoon, Halvard Sundström, the Ashtabula County building inspector, made a point of walking his rounds past Kirov's lot. Sundström was a man of code and consequence, a second-generation Swede who believed in right angles, sound lumber, and proven methods. He saw the meticulously dug 8 by 10-foot pit, 4 feet deep, and his face tightened. He watched as Kirov began lining the hole, not with wood, but with heavy blocks of granite he was hauling from a quarry inland. This wasn't just eccentric, it was a violation. Sundström made a note in his ledger. The Estonian was not just foolish, he was creating a documented hazard. The mockery from the community was casual. The judgment from the county would be official. What did this Estonian smoke sauna architect, a man whose trade was born in the forests of Setumaja, understand about foundation earth coupling that the established builders and seasoned inspectors of Ashtabula, Ohio, had so completely missed? This channel is dedicated to the lost wisdom of frontier innovators, the quiet geniuses who solved impossible problems with the materials at hand. Their stories are a testament to the power of observation and the courage to defy convention. If you believe that history holds practical lessons for today, I promise you will learn something vital about thermal science in this story. Please take a moment to subscribe and let us know in the comments what you think is the most overlooked aspect of historical construction. Jaan Kirov was not a carpenter, he was not a farmer, and he certainly was not a Great Lakes frontiersman. He was a sound architect, a builder of the traditional smoke saunas of the Setu people in southeastern Estonia. His hands understood the language of stone, clay, and heat. He had spent his youth not framing walls, but building the heavy, semi-subterranean chambers of saunas, structures designed to absorb and hold the fierce heat of a stone pile furnace for hours. He knew how a granite plinth could speak to the earth beneath it, how a corbelled arch could bear immense weight, and how the deep ground held a steady, silent memory of temperature, immune to the fleeting violence of the seasons. He, his wife Annie, and their two small children, Mart and Liana, had arrived in Ashtabula the previous autumn. Like so many others, they were drawn by the promise of steady work on the ore docks, a place where a strong back could earn a man a foothold in America. They spent their first winter in a standard company shack near the harbor, a flimsy box of green lumber on shallow posts. It was an education in the physics of misery. That winter had been a monster. Jaan had watched a neighbor, a big man from Gdansk, put his weight on a heavy iron ore shovel one morning. The forged steel socket, made brittle by the night's cold, snapped with a sharp crack like a rifle shot. In the harbor master's office, the ink in the main ledger had frozen solid mid-column, the entry for a newly arrived freighter trailing off into an icy smear. Jaan would never forget the sight of his own woolen cap, hanging on a peg inside their shack, cracking at the crown like a piece of pottery, when he lifted it to go to work. The cold was not merely an absence of heat. It was an active, aggressive force that broke metal, froze ink, and shattered wool. For Annie and the children, it was a season of constant shivering vigilance. They lived their lives in a 3-foot radius around the small pot-belly stove, a hungry god that devoured wood, but gave back only a grudging circle of warmth. Beyond that circle, the walls were coated in a fine, feathery layer of interior frost. Water left in a bucket overnight was a solid block by morning. Annie slept with Mart and Lena huddled together, all of them in their coats, under a mountain of thin blankets that never seemed to be enough. Jaan saw the fear in his wife's eyes, and the pale, pinched look on his children's faces. He was a builder. He had built structures to command and contain fire. He would not let his family be broken by ice. He swore an oath to himself, never again. The failure of the standard ore dock cabins was not a mystery. It was a simple, brutal equation. The structures were designed for speed of construction and economy of material, not for thermal performance. They were typically single-wall log or board and batten construction, with countless gaps for the wind to knife through. But the greatest flaw was in their foundation. They sat on wooden or stone piers, lifting the floor 2 or 3 feet off the ground. This was a technique imported from milder climates, meant to prevent rot and keep out pests. Here, on the shore of Lake Erie, it was a catastrophic mistake. The problem wasn't just the cold air. The problem was the wind. A 25-mile-per-hour wind at minus 22 degrees Fahrenheit, as was common during a polar surge, had the effective cooling power of temperatures far, far lower. By lifting the cabin off the ground, the builders had exposed not 4, but 6 sides to this relentless assault: the 4 walls, the roof, and the floor. The wind howled underneath the cabins, stripping heat from the floorboards as fast as the stove could produce it. The floor became a massive, cold radiator, actively pulling warmth down and away from the people huddled inside. Convection was the primary enemy. The hot air from the stove would rise, hit the frigid ceiling, cool instantly, and sink back down the icy walls, creating a constant, miserable internal draft. Families like the O'Malleys burned through 4, 5, 6 cords of wood in a winter, yet their children still coughed through the nights and their bread dough refused to rise. The fire wasn't heating the house. It was in a losing battle with the entire volume of Arctic air moving across the Great Lakes. The conventional cabin was an island of misery in a sea of cold. Jaan Kirov understood this. He wasn't going to build an island. He was going to build a harbor. The construction of Kirov's Folly became a source of daily commentary through the spring and summer of 1907. After digging the 8 by 10-foot pit to a depth of 4 feet, Jaan began the real work, the part that baffled everyone. He sourced heavy, irregular blocks of granite, paying a farmer a few dollars to haul them from a field being cleared miles inland. These were not neat, dressed stones. They were ancient, glacier-tumbled boulders. He laid the largest, flattest stones at the bottom of the pit to form a solid footing. Then he began to build the four walls of the chamber. He was not using mortar in the conventional sense. He was a master of dry stone technique, fitting the stones together with an uncanny precision, using smaller shims and chips to lock the larger blocks in place. As the walls rose, he began to corbel them inward, each successive course slightly overlapping the one below it. This was a technique as old as the pyramids, creating a stable, self-supporting structure that grew stronger as the load above it increased. When the stone chamber was complete, its opening at the top was smaller than its base on the floor. It was a granite vessel, sunk into the dense, cool clay of Ohio. Next, he laid the main sills for the 16 by 20-foot cabin. Two massive timbers spanned the top of the stone chamber, their weight resting directly on the corbelled plinth. The rest of the cabin's foundation rested on conventional piers around the perimeter. From the outside, it would look like a normal cabin, but its heart was this hidden stone room. In mid-April, as he was setting the sills, Halvard Sundström returned, this time in his official capacity. He carried a clipboard and a copy of the 1901 Ohio Residential Building Code. "Mr. Kirov," he began, his tone formal and devoid of warmth, "I am citing you for a violation of Section 12, Paragraph 4. Habitable sleeping quarters must be located above grade and possess adequate ventilation to the outside air." He pointed with his pen at the stone pit. "That is a cellar. You cannot have your family sleeping in a cellar. It is damp, it is unventilated, it is a breeding ground for consumption and diphtheria. It is against the law." He handed Jaan the official citation. The fine was $10, but the real threat was the order to fill in the hole and build a proper, conventional floor. Patrick O'Malley and a few others watched from a distance, their earlier mockery now tinged with a grim satisfaction. The law, at least, had common sense. Jaan took the paper. He read it slowly, his lips moving silently over the English words. He looked at Sundström, then at the granite chamber, then back at the inspector. He didn't argue. He didn't defend his methods. He simply said, "The ground is not the enemy." Sundström stared at him, baffled by the quiet, cryptic response. "Be that as it may, Mr. Kirov, the code is the code. You have 30 days to rectify this." He turned and walked away, confident in the authority of his office. Jaan folded the citation, tucked it into his pocket, and went back to work, fitting the first-floor joists over the chamber. The mockery lasted for the rest of the summer. The validation would have to wait for winter. Annie watched him, her heart a mix of fear and unwavering trust. When he cut a neat, sharp-edged trapdoor into the floor directly above the chamber, she simply asked, "Will we need a ladder?" "Steps," he said. "I will build strong steps." To understand what Jaan Kirov was building, you have to understand the profound stability of the earth itself. Just a few feet below the surface, the ground maintains a remarkably constant temperature year-round. In northern Ohio, this temperature is approximately 45 degrees Fahrenheit. While the air above might swing from 90 degrees in summer to -20 in winter, the earth beneath remains a massive, unwavering thermal battery. The standard cabin on piers was completely disconnected from this advantage. It was subject to every fluctuation of the air. Jaan's design did the opposite. It coupled the living space directly to this thermal mass. The key was the 8 by 10-foot stone chamber, 4 feet deep. This gave him a volume of 320 cubic feet, surrounded on 5 of its 6 sides, floor and 4 walls, by that constant 45-degree earth. The granite plinth walls were not an insulator, they were a conductor. They acted as a bridge, allowing the chamber's temperature to be governed by the earth, not the air. The second piece of the equation was the human body, A resting human generates about 250 to 300 BTUs, British thermal units, of heat per hour. John's family of three, himself, Annie, and Mart sleeping in the bunk, would generate a continuous, low-level output of roughly 750 BTUs per hour. The physics became a simple calculation of gains versus losses. The primary heat loss from the chamber would be through the insulated trapdoor to the cold cabin above. John, with his intuitive understanding of heat flow, calculated this loss to be minimal, around 200 BTUs per hour. So you have a constant gain of 750 BTUs and a constant loss of 200 BTUs. The surplus of 550 BTUs per hour would be steadily absorbed by the granite walls and the surrounding earth, but the massive thermal inertia of the ground would prevent the temperature from rising significantly. The system would find a point of equilibrium. The chamber, fed by the body heat of its occupants and anchored by the 45-degree earth, would stabilize at a comfortable, livable temperature. John's calculations suggested it would hold steady at around 62 degrees Fahrenheit. It wouldn't be warm and toasty like the air next to a stove, but it would be a deep, profound, and unshakable state of non-cold. While the cabin above might drop to 20 degrees and the wind outside might rage at 22 below zero, the sleeping chamber would remain a sanctuary. It was a 42-degree difference in experience, achieved not by burning more fuel, but by harnessing a force that was already there, silent and free. Winter arrived in December, not as a gentle dusting of snow, but as a declaration of war. A polar vortex, displaced from its usual Arctic home, sagged southward and squatted over the Great Lakes. For 11 straight days in January, the temperature in Ashtabula never rose, above minus 22 degrees Fahrenheit. A relentless 25-mile-per-hour wind blew off the frozen expanse of Lake Erie, a wind so cold it felt like a physical abrasion against the skin. For the families in the ore dock cottages, it was a state of siege. The wind was a living entity, a predator that sought out every crack, every nail hole, every poorly fitted window frame. The sound was incessant, a high, keening howl that vibrated in the bones. Inside the O'Malley cabin, Maeve O'Malley wept in frustration as her dwindling pile of firewood seemed to vanish into the stove with no discernible effect. The walls were canvases of frost. She and Patrick and their three children lived on the floor in a tangle of blankets. Their world shrunk to the few feet of warmth around the red-hot stove. 2 doors down, Einar Larsson's youngest daughter developed a deep, rattling cough that echoed in the frigid air of their single room. He spent his days stuffing rags into the gaps under his door, and his nights listening to his child's labored breathing, feeling utterly powerless. The cold was winning. In the Kirov cabin, a different reality prevailed. The main 16 by 20-foot room was by no means warm. It was cold, hovering at around 20 degrees. It was a functional space for cooking and daytime tasks, performed in coats and hats. A small fire in the stove was enough to keep the water from freezing and allow Annie to prepare meals. But they did not live in this room. They lived below it. Each evening, John would lift the thick, insulated trapdoor. No blast of frigid cellar air rose from the opening. Instead, a column of still, calm, cool but not cold air was perceptible. They would descend the wooden steps into their stone haven. The 8 by 10-foot chamber was a world apart. The air was absolutely still. The silence was profound, the howling of the wind completely absent, absorbed by the 4 feet of earth and the thick stone walls. The only sound was the soft breathing of his family. They had a wide bunk built against the north foundation wall, piled with wool blankets. Here, Mart and Lena slept soundly, their faces relaxed and peaceful, not pinched and blue. The proof of this separate world was in the small, mundane details. On a small shelf carved into the stone wall sat a jar of water that remained liquid day after day. A small pat of butter on a plate stayed soft and spreadable. This was the domestic warmth that proved the battle was won. One evening, as the wind screamed over the roof above, Annie sat on the edge of the bunk, mending one of Mart's socks. Her fingers were nimble. The thread was pliable. She was not shivering. She looked at Jaan, and in the quiet, steady light of a single oil lamp, she smiled. It was a smile of such profound relief and gratitude that it was more powerful than any fire. They were not just surviving, they were living. On the 9th day of the polar surge, Halvard Sundström was forced into a role beyond that of inspector. He became a crisis manager. The risk of house fires was extreme, as desperate families overloaded their stoves, their stovepipes glowing cherry red in the gloom. It was his duty to walk the rows of cabins, checking for violations and, more importantly, for signs of life. He was bundled in every layer he owned, his face wrapped in a wool scarf until only his eyes were visible. The cold was so intense his mustache had frozen into a solid block of ice against his lips. As he moved down the lane, he noted the columns of smoke pouring from every chimney, thick with the smell of burning green wood and desperation. Then he reached Kirov's lot. He stopped, confused. There was almost no smoke coming from the chimney, just a pale, thin wisp that was instantly torn away by the wind. Sundström's stomach tightened. This was the sign he dreaded. It meant the family had run out of fuel. It meant they were freezing. The Estonian's foolishness, he thought grimly, had finally met its consequence. He pounded on the door, his gloved fist making a dull, absorbed thud. "Mr. Kirov, Sundström, open the door." After a moment, the door opened a crack. Jaan Kirov stood there. Wearing a heavy coat and hat, the air that billowed out from the cabin was cold, confirming Sundström's fears. "Your fire is out," Sundström stated, pushing his way inside. "Are your wife and children all right?" "The fire is small," Jaan said calmly. "It is enough. They are well." Sundström's eyes swept the frigid room. It was 20 degrees, maybe colder. His own ears, exposed for only a moment, were beginning to burn with the first stage of frost nip. This was not a survivable temperature. "Where are they?" he demanded. Jaan simply pointed to the trap door in the middle of the floor. Sundström's professional certainty hardened into anger. "My God, man. You have them in that hole? In this cold? They'll be frozen solid." He strode over to the trapdoor, expecting to find a scene of horror. He expected a crypt. Jaan followed him, and without a word, lifted the heavy door. Sundström braced himself for a blast of damp, grave-like cold. It never came. Instead, he felt a gentle, almost imperceptible plume of still, mild air rise up to meet his face. It didn't warm him, but it didn't steal his heat either. It was neutral, calm. He blinked, confused, and peered down into the lamplit darkness. And there he saw it. On the bunk below, propped up on an elbow, was the boy, Mart. He was looking at a picture book. He was wearing a simple cotton shirt. As Sundström watched, the boy idly scratched his arm, his movements slow and comfortable. A boy in his shirt sleeves, in a cellar, while the world above them was locked in a crystalline hell. The sight broke something in Halvard Sundström. The rigid framework of his codes and conventions shattered against this impossible reality. "Let me see," he whispered, his voice hoarse. He descended the steps, his boots clumsy. The air in the chamber was silent and smelled faintly of clean earth, wool, and sleeping children. He looked at Lena, asleep under a blanket, her breathing deep and even. He looked at the jar of liquid water. He looked at the soft butter. And then he performed the act that would complete his conversion. He pulled off his glove and placed his bare palm flat against the granite wall. He expected to feel the biting, vampiric cold of stone in deep winter, a cold that would instantly numb his flesh. He braced for the pain. But the stone was not like that. It was cool, yes, but it was a deep, steady, living coolness. It wasn't taking anything from him. It was just there, stable, immovable, an anchor in a world of thermal chaos. He pulled his hand back and looked at it, then looked at Jaan, who had watched the entire process in silence. The inspector's face, a mask of professional certainty just moments before, was now a canvas of pure awe. The mockery of the community, the authority of the building code, the wisdom of generations of local builders. It all evaporated in the face of a small boy reading a book in his shirt sleeves. Sundström finally found his voice. He looked around the small, life-sustaining stone room, a space that defied every rule he knew. "You didn't build a room," he said, the words catching in his throat. "You built a harbor in the ground." The story of the Kirov cellar spread first by word of mouth, carried by a humbled and converted Halvard Sundström. He quietly visited Jaan a week later, after the cold snap had broken, and formally withdrew the citation. He didn't offer an apology. His actions were his apology. He simply asked Jaan if he would be willing to explain the design. News traveled quickly through the tight-knit Estonian community. The Amerika Eestlasta Selts, the American Estonian Society of Ashtabula, invited Jaan to their next meeting. He was no orator. He stood before them at a chalkboard, and instead of giving a speech, he simply drew. With a piece of chalk, he sketched a clean, precise cross-section of his cabin. The deep earth, the granite plinth, the corbelled walls, the cabin sills, the trapdoor. He labeled the key parts in Estonian and added the temperature figures in English. He drew arrows, showing the flow of heat from the sleepers into the great stable mass of the earth. He didn't speak of philosophy or genius. He just showed them the mechanics of survival. The society printed copies of the drawing on its small press and distributed them. By the following autumn, 6 other Estonian families on the ore docks had spent their summer digging. They built their own sub-cabin bunks, variations on Jaan's design, ready for the coming winter. The ultimate proof, the one that resonated most deeply with the women, was the kama. Kama was a traditional Estonian roasted grain flour, a mixture of rye, barley, wheat, and pea. Mixed with buttermilk or sour milk, it was a staple food. That January, Annie had given a small sack of it to Maeve O'Malley. Maeve had kept it on a shelf near her window. Within a week, the repeated freezing and thawing had caused the milk in the mixture to separate and sour, splitting the kama into a useless, inedible block. But the jar Annie kept on the stone shelf in their underground chamber remained perfect. It was thick, wholesome, and ready to eat, a taste of home preserved not by a fire, but by the gentle, constant embrace of the earth. Jaan Kirov's humble innovation was a brilliant piece of practical engineering, but it was also decades ahead of its time. What he had built using ancient knowledge and fieldstone was a rudimentary form of a modern passive geothermal system. He had intuitively grasped the principles that would one day be given formal names by building scientists. The earth beneath our feet is a massive thermal battery. Modern earth-sheltered homes and buildings with geothermal heating and cooling systems are all based on this same fundamental concept, using the planet's stable subsurface temperature to mediate the extreme fluctuations of the air. Jaan's granite plinth was, in modern terms, a heat exchanger, coupling his living space to this planetary reservoir. The concept of the thermal flywheel, using a large mass to absorb and release heat slowly, smoothing out temperature spikes, is a cornerstone of passive solar and sustainable design. Jaan Kirov, the Sedu sound architect, had built a high-mass, earth-coupled passive dwelling nearly a century before such terms would enter the architectural lexicon. He demonstrated that the most powerful tool in sustainable design isn't a new technology, but a deeper understanding of the forces that already exist. There are two ways to face a force like a Great Lakes winter. The first is to meet it with equal and opposite force. This was the conventional approach: to build a bigger fire, to burn more fuel, to wage a costly, constant, and ultimately losing war against the cold. It is an architecture of opposition, of fighting nature. Jaan Kirov chose a different path. His solution was not one of conflict, but of partnership. It was an architecture of quiet humility. He looked at the overwhelming power of the winter wind and the lake effect snow and chose not to fight it. Instead, he looked down. He recognized that while the air was a violent and fickle enemy, the earth was a deep and steadfast friend. His genius was not in creating warmth, but in finding where it already existed and simply building a door to it. He didn't build his bedroom against winter. He asked the earth under the cabin floor to hold it steady. The men who mocked him saw a man digging a grave. What they failed to understand was that he wasn't burying his house in the cold ground. He was anchoring it to the planet's deep, abiding warmth. The story of Kirov's Folly is a reminder that sometimes the most profound innovations come not from loud confrontation, but from the quiet wisdom of knowing what to fight and what to embrace. Thank you for joining us for this story. We hope it provided not just a compelling narrative, but also a deeper appreciation for the physics of survival and the hidden genius of our ancestors. If you found this story valuable, please like the video and subscribe to our channel for more explorations of historical ingenuity. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. What modern problem do you think could be solved with a forgotten, old-world technique? Disclaimer: this video presents historically inspired reconstructions for educational and storytelling purposes. The characters, names, and specific events depicted are fictional, while the techniques and scientific principles are based on real historical practices and building science. Any application of these or similar techniques today should be done in accordance with all current building codes, safety guidelines, and local regulations. This content does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.